Hey, Becoming Me. I'm so excited to introduce you to my warrior friend, Ken. Ken, welcome to Becoming Me.
Hey, glad to be here. This is going to be fun conversation. And Emily, I've enjoyed so much following you on LinkedIn and finally get to connect.
Hey, right back at you. And I truly love how social media can bring people together.
Yeah.
Connecting with you on LinkedIn and then following along on your podcast, your Instagram, I'm inspired and encouraged by you
Oh,
already.
thanks.
Yeah, no, like thank you. You're sharing the gift of you and your story, and I cannot wait to dive in. And I know there are people watching who are like, okay, I haven't met Ken on LinkedIn yet, Emily.
Yeah.
Who's Ken? So take a moment and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I've been married for 13 years. I have four kids. So at the time of this recording, they're 7, 6, 3, and 1. So I'm in the thickets of it. There are days where I am like, this is the best thing, and then other days I'm like, Lord, these are the most sanctifying moments of my life. But praise God for it. At the time of this recording, I work at a company. It's a goal achievement company called Full Focus. It used to be Michael Hyatt and Company, and I love my job. But on the side, I focus primarily on helping men kill shame, stand strong, and be on mission. And that's what my podcast, Shameless Podcast, is all about.
So powerful. And I'm really looking forward to unpacking what's made you who you are today because obviously you just unpacked like you have incredible things happening in and through your world. And so it makes me curious like what's your story? If you don't mind just taking some time and unpacking like what's made you who you are today.
Yeah, so it actually all started when I was young, right? My mom raised me in a church, but unfortunately, that was the extent of my religious faith. I was born and raised in New York City, and because of the environment that I grew up, my dad was always working 2, 3 jobs, just trying to make ends meet. I was first generation born here in the States. My parents are from Ecuador, but a lot of my past was actually skewed because of sexual abuse. So when I was around 3 or 4, I had started becoming sexually abused and introduced to pornography at around age 5. So that changed the trajectory of my life. There was a lot of repressed memories, a lot of anger that came through from that. And really, for years after that, I was just really angry at God. I did not want to do anything with religion. The biggest question that came to me quite often was just like, God, why would you let this happen? I was like, I'm trying to go to church. I'm trying to love you, Jesus. I'm trying to do these things that they say. But I knew all the stuff that had happened to me
Yeah.
and I couldn't reconcile that. As a young kid, I couldn't. And I just repressed it and just became really angry. And unfortunately, I walked into a life of sin because of that. Which fast forward, obviously, is God has redeemed and all those things. But that is the beginning of my story. I'll pause there, let you ask questions, and we could go from there.
I mean, I first thank you for sharing your journey and your story, and even the rawness of your anger at God and how you were
Yeah.
questioning Him. Because I think that's really important that we share. Like, one, you can ask those really hard questions, and God's not afraid of our emotions or our anger, and He invites us to bring that to Him. And you obviously gave us a little bit of where you are now. And so I would love for you just what's the middle? Like, this happens in your story. We see a snapshot of where Ken is today at the time of recording 2025. What happened in between moving from being angry, God, how could you let this happen to me, to where you are now?
Yeah. So, fast forward, probably at the age of 16. Okay, this is the culmination of a lot of things. I had been living a life of debauchery. It
Mhm.
was pretty sinful, and I had committed several sins that I thought were like unforgivable, and I started contemplating suicide.
Mhm.
A lot of it because of obviously sin committed to me, and then also sin that I committed to others. And I just couldn't reconcile those two things in my mind. So I was just like, it's better to end my life
Mhm.
than to be here. And I was in that situation. And for those of you who are listening, let me put this caveat. I normally do this before it, but like we are talking about a sensitive topic, and this may be triggering you. And even as I talk about abuse and suicide, you may be like, I have to pause this and I can't listen to this anymore. Like, I totally get that. I would encourage you that there is hope on the other end. We'll talk
Mhm.
about that here in a few minutes.
Mhm.
But know that I understand the suffering and the pain that you're going through and the frustrations that you might be feeling in this very moment as we're talking about this conversation. But I was there. I was just felt hopeless. So what I actually ended up doing was I decided, hey, before I end my life, I'm going to go seek help. So I actually went to my church,
Mhm.
and they had a counselor there, and I started talking to him. And this is the first time I ever shared my story, first time I ever shared my abuse with him and all the sin that I committed. And this was probably one of the most pivotal moments in my life because when I shared my story with him, it was actually the scariest moment I've ever had. I
Wow.
don't know if you ever, Emily, you've ever been in these situations, but like when you want to confess anything, you got those like butterflies in your stomach. You're like
Right.
afraid, you're worried. I was in that situation.
Mm.
And in that moment, I remember sharing all that completely vulnerable, feeling completely shameful about everything that had happened to me. And I remember this counselor
Mm.
um, started to justify all the sin that had happened to me. I remember him telling me, like, "Oh, Ken, the reason why you guys did this and the person who abused you who did this is because you guys were just bored and he was bored and you guys were just experimenting." And I remember all the anger that I had just bubbled up. And I walked out of his room and I said, "Never again, God, will I ever come into a church." And that day I was going to end my life. It was like around 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm laying in bed, just like cussing God. I was just so angry.
Mm.
And right when I was going to end my life, God miraculously just came into my room. Even to this day, it's so hard to explain how it all happened. But I just said, I'm done. I thought I was going to go to hell. So I was like, might as well just do it now. And God came in and just said, Ken, like, do not be discouraged. Do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Joshua 1:9. At that time, I didn't know that verse, but it just like, I felt like God spoke that to me. And I was just like, what is this? And I just started bawling. And what I realized in that moment, and this is why I bring all that into this conversation, is because when you are suffering,
Mm.
most people, when they're struggling, they don't need an answer, they need presence.
Mhm.
And they need the presence of God and they need someone to be there with them and acknowledge, like, hey, I see you, I hear you, and I know you. And
Mhm.
that was the first time I felt like God had intervened or someone just like was there for me in all my pain and all my frustration and all the anger and hate that I had. God was still there and he's like, I understand. I understand your abuse. He's like, my son was actually abused on the cross. Like, I understand that. And I remember that moment was the trajectory of saying, okay, God, I'm going to start following you. He's like, I have a lot of answer questions that I need answers to. I'm a very logical person in a lot of ways. I was like, I need scientific facts. I'm reasoning. Like, that's what I'm a kind of individual I am.
Mhm.
And we just took a long path of like answering a lot of my questions. Fast forward now to 19, um, I was still kind of like shaky in my faith,
Mhm.
and I actually got really, really sick. I mean, I was weighing like 99 pounds. I was going to the doctor's offices day in, day out because they couldn't figure out what was wrong. One doctor told me, Ken, we think you're gonna die. We don't know what's wrong with you. Like,
Mhm.
it's just crazy. It was just
Oh
like,
my.
and I'm like, God, I'm trying to serve you. I'm trying to love you, and now I'm gonna die. What the heck? Uh, this is a funny story. I went to the ER one day because I was
Uh-huh.
so bad shape. I had been sleeping in the ER room for, I don't know, probably like 3 hours waiting. I finally go in and they check my blood pressure and it was like 120 over something. They're like, what have you, were you running around? I was like, no, I just woke up. They're like freaking out. Just like, you should not be like this. They take my parents out of the room and they're like, listen, we need to know what kind of drugs you are on. And I'm like, I'm not on any drugs. I promise you I'm not. And they're like, no, 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 just tell us now or you're going to die. I'm like, I'm not on any drugs. It took weeks and months for them to find out what happened or what kind of illness I had. But during that time, obviously when you're 19 years old, your faith is shaky.
Mhm.
I was just trying to say, God, what do you want from me?
Mhm.
And it was this around this time that I fully surrendered in my life. And I said, Lord, if I have 2 weeks left, or ten years left,
Mhm.
I'll just give you my whole life. First time I felt like the gospel really infiltrated my heart. And come to find out, fast forward, the doctors found out what I had. At a 19-year-old kid, I had Graves' disease, which is a hyperactive thyroid, which at that time was not common for men at 19 to have. So that's why they couldn't find it for months. So when I was 19, God radically changed my heart. I gave my life to the Lord, and I that happened during a youth conference. And that youth conference had a discipleship program, and at that discipleship program, That's where I actually met a good counselor. And that's a whole nother story in and of itself. I have it on my podcast, but uh, God did a work in me. And
Mhm,
7 years later, I started to get married, have kids, be there and work for that ministry.
mhm,
But the beautiful part, and I'd never expected this, was that there were guys who started coming to me about their story of abuse,
mhm,
their story of shame, their story of pornography. And I just started helping them because I had been healed.
mhm,
And now, 15 plus years later, I've just helped hundreds of men
mhm,
who have this story of abuse and pornography addiction. They're just like, I don't know how to overcome this. I need help.
mhm.
And I just find it so amazing how God took my mess and made it into a message, right? Or my test and made it into a testimony. Old adages that people use, but
Yeah.
it was so true that for me, I stayed humbled. The
Mhm,
Lord did a miraculous work of healing in my heart now
mhm.
that I'm able to just share my story without a problem. I'm not like emotionally scarred by it.
Yeah.
I see the redemptive work of Christ in it.
Mhm.
So it's been beautiful to see how God is molding and shaping my life to
Mm.
help other men.
Wow. I mean, truly, thank you for unpacking your story, your journey, who you are, and who you're becoming. If you're willing to unpack this,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
curious to hear what is your relationship with the church like now? Because obviously we heard early on and some of the pain and the hurt, and then God's doing a work in your life. So what does that look like now?
Oh, yeah. That is a fantastic question. I for sure hated the church for a while. Uh, I guess I would say that, people were deconstructing. That's like the new word and new
Yeah.
thing. I probably was doing that back when I was 16, so that's what
Mhm,
20 plus years ago now.
mhm,
Um, but for me, I think when I started getting
mhm,
healing, one of the beautiful things that the counselor did was wanting me to connect to the body.
mhm.
And I found that there were other churches that were super welcoming, super helpful, and I found so many mentors there.
Yeah.
So while I had one incident with one individual from the church, that wasn't the whole church,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Um, man, I wasn't scarred, right? To the extreme that I was like abandoned the church. I am now like one of the biggest advocates for the local church. I want to help the local church. I want them to have great counselors and ministers and ministry leaders.
Mhm.
So a lot of my ministry has been also to like, hey, how do I help
Yeah.
ministry leaders thrive
Yeah.
so that they're not falling into the same trap that
Right.
that bad counselor did
Yeah.
for me.
That's powerful. Thank you for unpacking that. And, I would love to include in the show notes the episode on your podcast where you talk about the difference with the counselors,
Yeah.
if that's okay.
Oh yeah,
So
absolutely.
you guys are like listening to that and you're like, man, I want to hear the difference between that. That link will be in the show notes. You can listen to that episode on Ken's podcast. And Ken, I'm curious, are you a coffee drinker?
I am not, and it's
Okay.
a funny reason why. When I was 14,
Hmm.
I was like 4'11". That was my height, and I
Okay.
would not grow for the life of me. So I remember I went to a doctor. I had a
Uh-huh.
doctor's appointment, my annual physical, and they're like, "My son's not growing. He's 14." I was actually 15. Sorry, 15.
No.
Uh, and I was not growing whatsoever.
Oh
So
no.
they're like trying to figure out what's wrong with me, and they're like, "What's your daily, routine?" And
Uh-huh.
I'm like, "Oh, well, I eat breakfast." They're like, "Oh, what do you eat for breakfast?" I'm like, "Well, I drink coffee and I,
Mhm.
have eggs." And they're like, "Wait a minute, you drink coffee?" I was like, "Yeah, I've been drinking coffee since I was like 5." Welcome to Hispanic family. They're just like, "Hey, you want coffee? Here you go." So I'd been doing that. They're like, "Oh, coffee stunts your growth. You gotta just stop drinking coffee." No joke. Like 2 weeks later, I started growing,
No.
and it's a total myth. It wasn't the coffee, but it was just that thing that like it just perfect timing. But ever since then, I just kind of quit it, and I was like, I don't need it. I'm
Okay.
already really passionate,
Okay.
hyper, like energetic
Okay.
individual. Coffee just makes me like jittery, and I'm kind of like a over the hedge, the squirrel. Like
I
you give me
gotcha.
like coffee, I'm all over the
No.
place.
So are you a tea drinker or are you just one of those I only drink water kind of people?
I'll drink tea.
Tea.
Yes.
What kind of tea?
So, Bengal spice, ginger tea, like ginger spice. Like I
Okay.
love all kinds of tea.
Okay.
Just none with caffeine
None.
because
Okay.
caffeine just
Yeah. No.
I go
Not.
crazy.
Okay. So if you were sitting with a fellow warrior friend, you're having a cup of ginger tea with absolutely no caffeine.
Yeah.
Okay, we have checked. There's no caffeine in this, and you're just chatting about life. How would you encourage them to become who God made them to be?
Ooh, fantastic question. So the biggest thing I would say is, number one, completely surrendering their life to
Mm,
Christ.
yeah,
I think there are many times we surrender parts of our life, and this is actually part of the sanctification process, right? Where we're like, we'll give you this part, but we won't give you this part. But there are moments in our lives where God is asking you to surrender something,
right,
and you got to just give that up.
right.
The moment we hold on to something is the moment that we're saying, you know what, no, no, I'm God over my life,
Mm,
not you.
yeah,
So I want to make sure that we just surrender that.
yeah.
And the second thing is just like, delight yourself in the Lord because He will give you the desires of your heart. Like the best way to become the best, person that God has called you to be is not for you to always look inwardly. It's actually to focus on Christ
Yeah.
and His goodness and His grace and His blessings over your life. So I have learned in those seasons where I'm trying to figure out like how do I become, quote unquote, the best version of me.
Mhm.
It's just like, Lord, who do you say that I am?
Mm, yeah,
Right. And the more that I'm able to do that, then all of a sudden the third thing is like I now start to walk in my identity in Christ.
yeah.
Right. Like whatever you do it with to the glory of God, right? But it's all within your identity. And my identity is found not in the things that I do,
Right.
but in Christ. Now, going back to my abuse story just real quick.
Mhm,
People who have been abused
mhm,
and victimized, they have the hardest time trying to figure out what their identity is. So there are a lot of people who will run after just performance. They're like, let me go perform a certain way. Let me go do certain things. And no,
mhm,
no, no. God is actually saying, hey, no matter what happens in life, I am
mhm.
your provider. I am the one who tells you who you are. And it doesn't matter how broken you are. It doesn't matter how much you're trying to work and perform.
Yeah.
You're my child. You're my daughter. You're my son. And you're going to have a beautiful inheritance. So that's the way that I would tell people to say, hey, you want to know how to become the best that
Yeah.
God has called you to be? Do those things.
So good, so powerful. You've mentioned your podcast and what you do professionally. If somebody was listening and they're watching your story and they're like, man, I really want to connect more with Ken, where can they learn more about you and connect with you?
Yeah. So I would say Instagram is one way. So Ken Freire. And my last name is pretty complicated. So we'll just have that in the show notes or
Yes, we
LinkedIn as well at Ken Freire. You could go to beshameless.org.
yeah.
So that's the podcast. That's probably the easiest one than trying to pronounce my last name.
Hey, thank you. We'll have all the links, all the things in
Uh,
the show notes to make it easy for people to connect with you. But Ken, thank you truly for sharing your story, who you are, who you're becoming. You have invited us into a freedom story, and I cannot wait to continue to see what God does in and through you. And I'm cheering you on. Thank you.
thanks, Emily. Appreciate it.